Welcome to all of you. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to talk about reading comprehension. And you'll recall from your work that you've done not only in building literacy here in South Australia, but also remarks that Marianne Wolf made a couple of years ago, that reading is an unnatural act. That it's something that needs and demands the kind of attention and intention in order to be able to create those opportunities. And I like this particular visual because I think it speaks to perhaps a false assumption that somehow that reading, that learning, is simply a matter of pouring things into a brain and hoping that the right things come out. We know that there's so much more that's involved with that as well. You'll recall again from Marianne's work that there are three parts of the brain in particular that are really essential for that early literacy work. And if you take your index finger, your left index finger, and point it to the side of your brain, you'll see those three areas that are there. Those three areas that together must be recruited in order to be able to recognize words. Those three parts of the brain are already there, and they're doing other kinds of work. But our important early work that we do with students is to recruit those three parts of the brain. That phonological loop is absolutely essential to what it is that students are able to do. But we also know, too, that word recognition alone is not reading. It is absolutely essential. It's fundamental to what it is that students need to be able to do. It's foundational. But in and of itself, it isn't enough. It's our starting point. It's the place that we begin on that path. I like this reading rope that Hollis Scarborough brought to our field in thinking about how it is that we develop that really important first step. And they talk about, in particular, this idea that word recognition is essential, as well as language comprehension. You have to understand what it is that you're being told, that you're spoken to, that when you listen to books. And over time, those individual strands get carefully braided together in order to be able to build toward that more skilled reading. That reading rope is absolutely essential to what it is that students need to be able to do as they start out on that journey, on that path, in order to build their reading comprehension. But again, reading is more than word recognition and language comprehension. I like this definition that Tim Shanahan offers about how it is that we read and what it is that we do when we read for meaning. His definition is this. He says that what it is that we do is we read text and we make meaning by negotiating both the affordances and the barriers that we encounter in text. Our children need to learn over time how it is that they negotiate what those affordances are, those smooth sailing parts of reading, where they're really picking up momentum, and that they know what to do whenever they strike a barrier. How do you negotiate past that barrier? I imagine that at least some of you own your own personal child. Do you have your own personal one? In addition to the hundreds or thousands of other children that you have, you may have your own personal ones. And I like this particular analogy for how it is that we teach children to read. If you have your own personal child, and that personal child has been a teenager, you perhaps have had the opportunity to be able to teach that teenager how to drive. Do you remember that? Do you remember the terror that you probably had. Please don't wreck my car, right? Please don't hurt anybody else in the process. And I recall my own first driving experiences with my dad taking me out to an empty off-season swimming pool parking lot in order to be able to have my first experiences behind the wheel of a car. And you may recall that those early experiences for your own children, your own young drivers, included being able to name what those parts were, and to be able to figure out how it was that you operated those parts. But simply being able to maneuver that vehicle around that empty swimming pool parking lot was not the same as driving. It was an important first step in being able to do so. But what you have to do as a driver is to do exactly what it is that Tim Shanahan talks about in reading. That you have to negotiate both the affordances and the barriers that are happening. You have to make decisions. You have to understand when it's going to be time to be able to speed up, and when are other times where you need to approach more carefully, or perhaps you need to be able to move past that. The reading that we teach to children over the period of time that we have them in schools is much like teaching them how to drive. That we have to teach them those affordances and those barriers and what it is that you do when you encounter each. I'll draw on some of the theory that underpins what it is that we do. And the first person that I'll talk about is Thorndike. And I love this idea that he said 100 years ago that comprehension, understanding, is really a cooperation of forces. I think about Marianne Wolf's talk about phonological loops and the recruitment, the coordination, the cooperation that's needed. Thorndike was saying that 100 years ago. Here's another theory. This is Walter Kinch's construction integration theory. Now, I hope that you're feeling the way I do. I feel 20% smarter just because I put this diagram up here. I'm like, I must be a very educated person because I have access to this particular diagram. It's very complicated, right? But here are the two things that I want you to hang out with this. Again, consistency in what it is that we know about reading. That what Kinch talked about is that understanding, comprehension is about construction, and it's about integration. So I've got Marianne Wolf with recruiting those three parts of the brain. I've got Thorndike saying it's a cooperation of forces. I've got Walter Kinch saying that it's about construction and about integration. There's consistency here. We'll talk about one more theory, and this is from the Rand reading report at the turn of this last century as well. And Catherine Snow and her colleagues talked about the importance of comprehension in understanding what the components are. That comprehension is not just the text, but it's also the reader and what the reader brings to the text. And it's the activity that's associated with that. What is it that you want them to do with that text? How is it that we're constructing that in our classroom? And all of that floats in a sea of that sociocultural context. What it is that our students bring to our classrooms through their community experiences, through their family experiences, and so on. That's where reading comprehension really lies. As educators, it's important that we understand what the theories are. And I do want to assure you that I am not going to be talking about theoretical constructs of reading comprehension for all of my remarks, but it is foundational to what it is that we do. That we have lots of research that tells us about those theoretical constructs and how it is that we can think carefully and closely and scientifically about what reading comprehension is. However, despite the fact that we have those theoretical constructs, we have less attention that's been put on how it is that we turn theory into practice with reading comprehension instruction. And that, for us, is the work that we all do with teachers. How do we translate what it is that we know about reading comprehension theory and turn it into practice, turn it into things that are meaningful for teachers, for school leaders, for communities, and especially for the children that we serve? And so what I'd like to offer is a way of thinking about reading comprehension instruction across three constructs: the skill, the will, and the thrill. I hope that you enjoy all of my rhyming that I just did for that. Skill, will, thrill. It's got a nice ring to it, right? Skill, will, thrill. But I think it's important to understand that while we have always had knowledge and information about reading comprehension skills, they have tended to sit in a silo. While we have always had knowledge and information about motivation, about will, it has tended to sit in a silo. And while we have always, as you heard the minister talking about this morning, as well as the CE, about the thrill, the joy, the delight of reading and what it means to us, that often has sat in yet a third silo. And our goal is to be able to bring all three of those things together from the very beginning, from the first day of school, for every child. We don't need to wait until they reach a certain level before we ensure that those are happening. So here's what I mean by skill and will and thrill. That in skill in particular, that students need to be able to decode and understand what that text says. But they also need the will to be able to persist when the text gets difficult. And they need the thrill that comes when you get to take consequential action because of what it was that you read. So we're going to talk about skill and will and thrill. And I'm going to turn this conversation over to you. There'll be a couple of times this morning where I'll ask you to go ahead and have a conversation with somebody who's seated near you. And what I'd like to spark as a discussion for you is one of two questions that I've got up there. You can pick one and talk about that. What perhaps does this spark up for you in terms of your leadership and literacy practices? When we think about skill and will and thrill, and we think about recruitment, cooperation, and so on, what are things that spark up for you? Or perhaps, what's a new angle that you're thinking about as well? So I'll turn this over to you. It's an opportunity for you to turn your heads, move your mouths, say hello to people. What are you thinking about right now? So let's talk about skill. That's a place and entry point for us to be able to consider the skill, the will, the thrill of reading comprehension along the way. Skill is essential in developing their understanding of how it is, especially for early readers, that they begin to be able to decode what's going on the page, what those squiggly little black lines are all about. For young readers, that's what it is that we're doing. And for older readers, for readers that are moving past those early decoding stages, how is it that we're building basic understanding of what it is that students are learning about? Sometimes I hear these two terms used sort of interchangeably, but I'd like to kind of tease those apart just a little bit. Sometimes I hear about skilled readers, sometimes I hear about strategic readers. And I'll draw back on Shanahan's definition once again about reading, affordances and barriers. Skilled readers are at any given time enjoying the affordances of reading. The reading is going along swimmingly. There are times for all of us in any reading that we do where the reading is going along swimmingly. Nothing is getting in the way of my understanding. If you knew me, you'd know that I am all about right now, I'm all about Megxit. Okay, I got to find out more about that all the time. All right, I'm just putting that out there right now, right? And when I'm reading about that, things are going along swimmingly for me. I'm reading those affordances. That's a skilled reader. At other times, and sometimes in the same piece of text, sometimes we're strategic readers. Strategic readers are what it is that we do when we encounter those barriers, when the understanding slows down a bit, or when we say to ourselves, wait a minute, I got all the way to the end of that paragraph and I don't really know what it means. I need to go back and reread again. At any particular time, we are some balance of skilled reading and sometimes strategic reading that's happening along the way. And those skills feed directly into what it is that we want students to be able to understand. So I'll do a little bit of discussion about reading comprehension and what it is that we know about those reading skills in particular. Some of you know the work of Scott Paris. If you don't know him by name, you certainly know his work. If you've ever been to a classroom anywhere and there's been a poster that says something about here's what good readers do, that's Scott Paris's work. That's one of the things that he has brought to the field. And he talks about this idea of understanding what are constrained skills in reading and what are unconstrained skills in reading. Constrained means that there are boundaries. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Unconstrained is the opposite. It's free form. It goes on apparently forever. There is no end point to all of that. And he says that in terms of constrained skills, children must learn these skills. They must learn phonemic awareness. In the English language, there are 44 phonemes. Worldwide, there are about 88 phonemes altogether. There are overlaps of phonemes for different languages. None of them match up completely and utterly. But regardless of which language a child is learning and learning in, he or she must be able to detect the sounds of that language. Phonemic awareness, essential for students in learning how to read. Another aspect of this is around phonics. How is it that we take the symbols of the language and bolt onto them the sounds of the language? We put those two things together and we call that phonics. Phonics can never be left to chance. Phonological awareness can never be left to chance. Phonemic awareness can never be left to chance. We have to make sure that any gaps that possibly could emerge, that we're doing our level best to make sure that they don't happen in the first place, or if they have happened, that we find ways to be able to close them. And a third aspect of constrained skills is fluency. Now, fluency has a longer tail. Fluency goes out to about the end of year 8, but it does have a ceiling. There's only so quickly at a certain rate that you're able to read and still maintain understanding. And you can't be more than 100% accurate. As fabulous and wonderful as I am certain this particular crowd is, none of you can be 110% accurate. None of you can. There is a ceiling effect that goes with that. Those skills are essential for students to be able to read. They are absolutely foundational to what it is that they're learning how to do. And here's the thing about constrained skills. Because they are constrained, they're easy to count. So we can count, we can document quantitatively how it is that students are doing in terms of being able to develop that. Let's take a look at this reception teacher. I had to learn that word, by the way. I'm expanding my vocabulary because in the States, she's a kindergarten teacher. But here, she's a reception teacher. This teacher, her name is Luz. She's about 6 weeks into the school year. And the students that she works with all speak Spanish as a first language, and they spend half the day learning in Spanish and half the day learning in English. So her instruction during the development of phonemic awareness and phonological awareness and so on is in English. We'll play just a couple of minutes of some things that she's doing with students.
Stand up, let's warm up our voices. Let's get ready to read and write. Ready, Avery? I won't forget no more, no more. I won't forget no more. Turn! I won't forget no more. A says. B says. C says. D says. Okay, friends. A says ah. A says ah. Every letter makes a sound. A says ah. Hands up, hands up, hands up. Ready? Here we go. You're going to get your sounds. We're going to put them together. Hands up. K, ah, k, ah, k, ah. Ka, ka, ka. Like cat. Letter S. S, ah, s, ah, s, ah. Sa, sa, sa. Letter L. Ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, la, la, la. Letter H. Ah, 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 ha, ha, ha. Here's your challenge. What if I change the last sound to D? Hands up, hands up. Had, 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 had. What if I drop the first sound and change it? Letter T. T. Add, t, add, t, add. Tad, tad, tad. Tadpole. What if I switch our sounds? Switch letter T.
And certainly you get the idea, and I imagine that that is a very familiar sight in any primary classroom that's happening. While the children are enjoying and experiencing something that is entertaining and fun for them, they're singing, they're dancing, they're chanting, and so on. What the teacher understands is there are all kinds of constrained skills that are being taught and practiced during that particular time. But as much as Paris talks about constrained skills, he also talks about unconstrained skills and how it is that we need to balance and make sure that we're addressing all of those things. The unconstrained skills, the skills that have no boundaries, include comprehension, understanding, and vocabulary. Your vocabulary today is better than it was 5 years ago. Your comprehension 5 years from now is going to be better than it is today because you're going to know more along the way. These are more difficult to be able to measure. And very often the measurement systems that we use are things like informal reading inventories, for example. Those vocabulary and comprehension skills are just as critical for students to be able to learn how to do. And again, for those of you that own your own personal child that is perhaps a younger one, I can only imagine that you did not wait until they entered school in order to begin reading books to them, because they understand at rates that far exceed what it is that they're able to do on a printed page as well. So we make sure that we're building knowledge, that we're having conversations, even with our very youngest children, because we know that their listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension, and that it takes many years of schooling before it is that those two come together. That's why it's so critical that we make sure that students, as a part of their reading diet, especially for younger students, are also getting the kinds of knowledge-building experiences, even if they're not able to independently read them themselves. Now, sometimes a way of being able to think about this is that those constrained skills are those foundational or basic skills, absolutely critical, and that those unconstrained skills, which are sometimes referred to as higher order or critical reasoning skills, are equally important. And here's the news. Basic skills develop independently, from higher reasoning skills, and vice versa. They have two different paths. All of the vocabulary and comprehension instruction in the world is not going to build students' understanding, knowledge around phonemic awareness and phonics, and vice versa. Simply having them confined only to experiences where they are developing those phonemic awareness and phonics skills will not lead to those deeper comprehension and vocabulary skills. We have to think about two streams that are happening for our students and to carefully construct what those experiences are going to be for them. A challenge can happen with older students who are not yet making expected progress. And that is that at times, well-meaning educators may actually restrict their exposure to text based only on their constrained skills development and forget that they need to also be building those comprehension and vocabulary skills as well. And Al Tatum, who is a reading researcher who's dedicated his research to the literacy lives of African American teenage boys, says that in fact, leveled text lead to leveled lives. We have to make sure that our students, especially those who are not yet making expected progress, are able to have access to the knowledge-building kinds of experiences that their peers are having as well. And what he reminds all of us is that we have to make sure that we're also teaching with what he calls enabling texts. That we have lots of experiences for those older children that are not yet making expected progress to build their knowledge along the way. Because something that we do know is that knowledge eats reading ability for lunch. Your knowledge about something is predictive of your reading comprehension. Not only your constrained skills, but also the amount of knowledge that you bring to the text. There's a study that was done that has been replicated a number of different times with lots of different students in lots of different subject areas and ages. But I'll talk about the original one that is sometimes referred to as the baseball study. And this, of course, was done in the States, hence baseball. And what these researchers did is they worked with students who were in year 7. And they divided students up into 4 different categories across 2 variables. The first variable, what was their reading ability as measured by some formal assessments. And then the second variable was what was their knowledge of baseball. And they chose baseball because they figured that it wouldn't be a topic that would be taught formally in school. They wanted it to be a knowledge base that you either knew something about or you didn't know something about, and it wasn't likely that you learned about it in school. And so they divided the kids up into these 4 categories, based, as I said, on their reading ability as well as how much it was that they knew about baseball. And then they had students read several different passages that had to do with baseball and to be able to address the comprehension questions, both surface level as well as deeper level comprehension questions. And here's what they found out. No surprise that the students who performed best were those students who had high levels of reading ability and high levels of baseball knowledge. But look at who came in a very dangerously close second. Those kids who had perhaps low reading ability levels but high levels of baseball knowledge, because your knowledge helps to predict how much you comprehend about a text. The kids that came in a distant third were the kids that had high levels of reading ability on those reading measures, but they had low levels of baseball knowledge. We have to make sure that knowledge building is an essential part of what happens in all of our classrooms because it means so much, it matters so much in terms of reading comprehension. I heard this sentence several weeks ago on my radio, and here's what it said. The size slowly tapers off through the day today, but best spots we'll still see sets rolling in that push a foot or 2 overhead. Now, I can decode all those words. I have a basic understanding of what those words individually mean. But without context, for me, it would have been difficult to understand that. Fortunately, what I knew was that it was the surf report. I live in San Diego, and every day on the radio, there's a surf report that's on. And they said, here's the surf report for today. And this is what the announcer said, among other things. So at least I had that context to be able to understand that. However, I'm not a surfer. I know you're shocked. I know you're shocked. You're like, what? What? Yeah, I'm not a surfer. And so while I had the context, sort of similar to low baseball knowledge, right? I couldn't tell you whether this meant that it was a good day or a bad day to go to the beach, because I didn't have those high levels of knowledge. I had some level of knowledge along the way. And that's what we refer to as schema. Schema is everything you know, and it plays a part in what happens with reading comprehension. So I'm going to switch gears here, and we're going to talk about a little bit of instruction that goes along with those skills. And direct instruction in particular is incredibly valuable, especially when we're introducing new skills to students, whether they are constrained skills or unconstrained skills. Direct instruction has a pantload of evidence. And by the way, that is a research term. I know that this is kind of a research conference, and so pantload is actually a research term that I like to use. There's a pantload of evidence that says that direct instruction works when you're introducing new skills to students. But there can be, at least in the States, I don't know about here, there can be some resistance to the idea of direct instruction. So I will submit to you one piece of evidence that direct instruction really works by showing you a short video of what I consider to be the best direct instruction ever.
One more time, ready? 2, aya! Harder, okay? 3, aya! Okay, chariot. Let's see. Chariot. Fighting set shot. Aya! Okay. Break it and shout. Ready? Go! One leg, okay? Ready? Go! This way. Aya! Okay, right leg. Ready? Go! No, right leg. Go! One more time. Power! No, one more time. Uh-oh, you're not gonna get your bell unless you break it. Fighting stance. Follow me. Aya! Ready? Go! One more time. Hit over here. No. No laughing. Ready? One more time. Go! Aya! One more time. Ready? Go! Wow! Okay, chariot. Chariot. Don't move. Hands up. Now you will have your white belt. Okay? Chariot. Don't move.
There was skill that was involved with that. Certainly, what it was that his teacher was teaching him was obviously direct instruction. And direct instruction includes these kinds of things. That it is about building for relevance, that there's modeling and checking for understanding, that there's guided instruction that occurs, that we make sure that there's an opportunity for closure, for bringing a lesson back together, and for some independent learning. But I think that what you also saw too, for that video in particular, was that you also saw the will of that little boy. The motivation to stick with something even when it was difficult. And by the way, that came from the confidence that his instructor had, that you can do this. You might not be able to do this on the very first try, but I'm not going to give up on you. We're going to keep doing this until you get it right. And of course, we saw the thrill that happens whenever you master something that you couldn't do before. We have to make sure that the will and the thrill also happen from the very earliest stages for learners. We also need to understand, too, that when it comes to building skills, that teacher modeling is an essential part of this. That teacher modeling is a tool that we have available to us to be able to use. Why do we model? There's, again, a lot of research that suggests how effective teacher modeling can be, that it provides those readers and writers with examples, that it gives you an opportunity as a teacher to be able to make your thinking apparent to students, and that there is a mirror neuron system in the brain that helps with that modeling. Mirror neuron systems were identified about 25 years ago now and understood to be an important part of how it is that we survive as a species, especially by being able to watch what somebody else does and begin to incorporate that into our own behaviors and our own insight into what's happening. What we know about mirror neuron systems in particular is that you watching somebody do something lights up the same part of your brain as if you were doing the same action. Simply watching it is enough. When I watched Kristi Yamaguchi spinning around on the ice doing an ice skating demonstration, the same parts of my brain are lighting up as Kristi's. Now, I do want to say I'm not able to do what it is that Kristi does, but it begins to build a pathway. It has led to the emergence of this idea that modeling is something that is as powerful as it can be. Never underestimate the power of modeling. Child watches way too much TV. I'm just going to say that. But hey, mirror neuron systems. His brain is lighting up just like Rocky's brain is lighting up. And with practice and over time, they begin to be able to develop those same skills. And it's led to this idea of what is sometimes referred to as embodied semiotics. That what it is that you read lights up the same parts of your brain as what would be going on with the character. So for example, when you read grasp the cup, your motor area that is related to your hand just lit up. When you read kick the ball, your foot motor area lights up in your brain. You can't help it. The reading of that helps students to be able to understand what it is that's happening. Now, of course, we're not only teaching kids how to grasp the cup or to kick the ball, but that teacher modeling is an essential part of how it is that we apprentice them into the cognitive and metacognitive skills that we need for them to be able to develop. And we know quite a bit about what makes for an effective think aloud, especially in being able to name what that strategy is, so that students can begin to create a file, a mental file for themselves about how it is that they go about doing things. So I'll turn this conversation back over to you again as we close out skill, and you'll remember our coming back signal around waterfall. Here are two possible questions that you may want to talk about with somebody near you. One question might be, have you heard a confirmation about skills in reading comprehension, or what is some new knowledge that you want to make sure that you put into play? So talk to somebody that's near you, and we'll come on back in just a couple of minutes. It's important that anytime for learners of any age that we have opportunities to be able to use that oral language, to be able to verbalize what our thinking is at the time, because it helps us, it helps all learners, whether you are 5 or 15 or 35 years old, it helps all learners with being able to move from working memory into more long-term memory as well. So we've been talking about skill in reading comprehension, but let's move on to that second stage, which is the will around reading comprehension. The will to be able to move forward even when a text is difficult, to persist. It's about engagement in particular, how it is that we engage and re-engage our learners all the time. Do you have kids that look like this? This child is busting out with an idea that she can't wait to share. She's got something profound to be able to offer. Or she has to go to the bathroom really bad. I'm not sure, right? Those outward signs of engagement tell us some things, but not everything. Here's my reality. I work at a middle and high school in San Diego, and here is one of my students from 9th grade and an exchange that he and I had. I like to think that I'm engaging, but apparently to Edgar on that particular day, I was not. Now, it may have something to do with the fact that I taught him in year 9 in a writing class that began at 7:30 every morning and went on till 9 o'clock in the morning. An hour and a half starting out the day for a 14-year-old boy who has to do that to his hair every morning. Probably not completely and utterly engaged with what it was that was going on in the classroom. Now, I will say this, Edgar graduated from high school. He got married. He has children of his own. He has a job. He pays taxes. I feel like I have done my work for society in making sure that this kid actually became a contributing member of society. Because at the age of 14, I wasn't so sure. Some of us look around at some of our students and go, oh my heavens, they're going to vote on how I get taken care of when I'm old, right? So if nothing else, be nice to kids. I'm just saying. They're going to decide what your health care is when you're an old person as well. I had another student say this to me years ago, and it has stuck with me ever since. Yeah, kind of discouraging, but it's really true. Have you ever stood in the parking lot at school and just watched like the really tired teachers coming out at the end of the day? The kids are all like this, ah, and the teachers are just dragging themselves to the car, right? We have to make sure that we engage students, but we engage them in ways that are useful to them, that have a nice balance between the cognitive work that they're doing and the cognitive work that we're doing as well. I also, when I think about engagement, think about things like this, right? Because, and by the way, the most addictive game ever, Tetris, high levels of engagement. In fact, I have a friend who plays Candy Crush, and I'm thinking about running an intervention with her because it's getting a little, I think it's intruding on the quality of her life along the way. When we think about engagement, very often we look at those outward signs of behavior. And certainly behavioral engagement tells us some things about what it is that students are doing and learning and so on. But there's also a limit into the behavioral engagement, the outward engagement that's going on. We have to also look deeper at the cognitive engagement that's happening with students. Cognitive engagement takes a little bit more effort on the part of us as educators to be able to kind of suss that out about how it is that a particular student is cognitively engaged, not just behaviorally engaged. And we can never, ever overlook the fact that emotional engagement is foundational to everything it is that happens. Because we know this, no meaningful learning occurs without a meaningful relationship. Relationships are at the foundation of what it is that we do, and they certainly are useful in being able to foster the will that students need, not only in reading comprehension, but in the learning that they do in general in school. Those 2 circles that are at the bottom are certainly a part of those important skills that we teach, those reading comprehension skills, those vocabulary skills, and so on. But what sits on top of them are the social skills, the relationships, the emotional skills that are needed as well. How is it that we engage kids emotionally in the work that we do? How is it that we make sure that they are moved by the stories that they read about other people and about themselves? How is it that we make sure that they are moved by stories about the earth and what it is that we need to do better to be the caretakers that we need to be for this planet to be able to survive? That emotional piece cannot be lost on how it is that we teach for reading comprehension. Guy Claxton has this great diagram, and he calls it the learning river. And he says, you know, when you think about a river, when you gaze at a river, you've got a beautiful river that's just outside of this facility. What we can see is on the surface. And that's often, in a classroom, that's knowledge. We can see that as educators pretty readily, what their knowledge levels are. But what's underneath the surface, what's deeper, are those habits, those dispositions, those attitudes that are harder to be able to determine. You have to spend time with kids in order to be able to understand what their attitudes and what their dispositions are. One of the things that we have to thank in the States for your country is in bringing to us restorative practices and what it is that restorative practices looks like. At the school where I work, restorative practices is an important part of what happens. And the person who heads up our restorative practices effort often is working with students who academically are not exhibiting the kinds of engagement that we want to be able to see. And what he reminds all of us as a staff is that we need to stop asking what's wrong with that kid, and we need to start asking what happened to that kid. Because the chances are good that it'll break your heart what happened to that kid. We have to go deeper into those attitudes, into those dispositions, and so on. Some things that we know about teaching around motivation as it relates specifically to reading comprehension is that motivation and reading comprehension are closely associated with each other. In the same way that knowledge is closely associated with reading comprehension, so is motivation. And many of us have encountered in our own personal children, as well as the children that we're privileged to be able to serve, we have seen children again and again be able to read and understand things that we never would have thought that they were able to do because they were motivated in making sure that they did so. But here's an important message to also carry back to the schools that all of you support, and that is this: the effectiveness of a teacher's reading comprehension instruction is mediated by the attitudes, the motivation of a particular student. Why do we see a range of experiences that are happening within a particular classroom? Because not every child has the same level of motivation. So we have to think closely about that motivation and how that can happen. In addition, we have to make sure that we're paying attention to the kinds of self-concepts that students are going. We know that low reading concept, and this was noted in remarks earlier this morning, begin as early as the end of first grade. That kids' beliefs in themselves can get crushed really early. We have to make sure that we are not dream crushers for those children that are learning how to read and perhaps struggling a bit along the way. So what are some things that we know about motivation as it relates to reading comprehension instruction? It's fueled in particular by things like relevance and interest and choice. It's also fueled by levels of challenge and the emotion that is brought with it as well. John Hattie, and I know that you're familiar with his work, has a great phrase for this. He says, we have to find the Goldilocks level of challenge. Not too hard, not too boring. right? I really like that idea. I know as a teacher, I'm always looking for that sweet spot. And there are times where I overshoot and I undershoot along the way. But I'm looking for that sweet spot. What's the right level of motivation and challenge that I can have for students? We also know, too, that it has a strong influence on their learning, as well as that deep motivation. You need to get out of the way of a kid that is motivated to be able to read, motivated to be able to learn. But it's up to us to figure out how it is that we can leverage those things. Kids don't arrive at our classroom door being instantly motivated by all of the things that happen. It's up to us. We are active participants in making sure that motivation happens. Graham Nuthall, who was a wonderful researcher here in Australia, and you're probably familiar with his work, The Hidden Lives of Learners. And what Graham said is that approximately 40 to 50% of instructional minutes end up getting devoted by accident to things that kids already know how to do. Now, of course, there's more subtlety to this because it's not the same 40 or 50% for every child. But we are looking at, according to his work, something around the order of about 15% of instructional minutes overall devoted to teaching kids things that every kid in the class already knows how to do. It's an argument for differentiation. It's an argument for watching closely what it is that children are able to do and what they are not yet able to do, so that we can offer those kinds of supports. That's incredibly motivating when somebody sees you and they know what it is that you know so far and where it is that you need to go next. The danger, if we don't know, if we don't pay attention, if we don't look closely, the danger is around boredom. The strongest negative influence of all in student learning is boredom. And boredom happens in two different ways. Boredom happens for students who already know this material and are bored out of their minds with what it is that they're learning in school. And by the way, I'm not talking about 7 minutes of boredom. I'm talking about a year's worth of boredom. I'm talking about routine and systematic boredom. But there's another condition that happens with boredom, and that is this: kids who you lost in the first week of school because it was too hard, because it was too difficult, because they couldn't find their way, and they tune out, and they don't attend, they don't engage with the work that's going on because it's too difficult for them. We have to be on guard to be able to look closely at what that boredom is. A strong influence is on helping kids to set their learning goals. And keep in mind that learning goals are not the same goals for every child in the class, but it's working closely with kids and talking about what their particular goals are. Here's a picture of a poster with individual goals that kids have developed for themselves in support with their teacher who has helped them with that. And I love this one in particular, this close-up. My goal as a student is to get better at subjects I find difficult. Get out of that kid's way. Get out of his way. Because when you have that kind of goal for yourself, even if you are not yet at the place that you want to be, the chances are very, very good that you will get to the place that you want to get to. In looking at your documents, I certainly see around the National Quality Standard 5, this reminder that every student needs to be encouraged and supported, that it's systematic, that it's intentional, and that we're really looking closely at how it is that they're making progress. Choice is another essential part of motivation, making sure that students have lots of choice that's available for them. By the way, I'm not talking about simply turning over the classroom to kids and going, have at it, because we know some things about what it is that they need to learn. But we also need to find those opportunities for students to be able to engage in lots of different choice kinds of activities. One of the things that, as I reviewed your documents around world-class literacy and being able to reach every child, is making sure that choice and relevancy are something that are ever present in the text that we choose, the text that we make available to students. And to build on that even further, the Aboriginal education strategy of making sure that these kinds of books, these kinds of materials, and these kinds of experiences are something that happen routinely, systematically, and intentionally in all of South Australia is essential. And of course, I don't need to remind anyone in this audience that these kinds of experiences are not only for some communities. As Australians, every Australian needs to know this story, needs to know the stories of communities that they live in and other communities that are here in the state, so that they can carry forward what those stories are and to help in being able to create communities in the future that do better, that are better, and that are stronger. Another element around choice is this idea of what Linda Gambrell calls a blessed book. And she says a blessed book is simply this: saying to a child, saying to an adolescent, I read this book and I thought of you, and handing that book to that child. Many of us remember somebody doing that in our lives as well. Now, I will say this, I work with teenagers, so sometimes I use a little bit of reverse psychology. The reverse of the blessed books work really good with younger kids. They don't always work really well with those 14-year-olds. Keep Edgar in mind in particular. So I have been known to do this. Hey, I just got this really good book and I wanted to share it with you. I haven't read it yet, but I heard that it was really good. So let me just read you the first page. And I begin to read the first page, and then for effect, dramatically, I stop. And I close the cover and I go, oh no, I didn't know it was about that. And I put it on the shelf. And you know they're like this. A forbidden book? There must be a bad word in it, right? So sometimes that can happen too. Sometimes your blessings might be a little bit of reverse psychology. You've got to know your students and who they are. So I'll turn this discussion back over to you. In what ways have you seen teacher-student relationships really boosting learning? Or perhaps, why is it that you know that negative relationships inhibit learning? So I'll turn this over to you, another quick 2-minute turn and talk. No meaningful learning happens outside of a meaningful relationship. Those relationships are essential in order for us to be able to leverage the will that is needed, the persistence that is needed, the grit that is needed in order to comprehend at deeper levels. And that last aspect that I want to talk about is the thrill of reading comprehension. I can only imagine the thrill that happens in the minister's house when he and his daughter find the green sheep. I can only imagine what that is. We saw the thrill of that young child who sensed his own accomplishment and was overjoyed at being able to do so. And thrill, when it comes to reading comprehension, can sometimes be those outward signs of delight. But more often, they really come from being able to act upon your private world and your public world. As was noted earlier this morning, we are all walking libraries. Jason Reynolds, who is a young adult author and a recent Pulitzer Prize winner, talks about the fact that each of us is a walking library that is filled with the text that made a difference for us in our own lives. And we know what those texts are. We want to be able to build walking libraries in our own classes, among our own students. And that thrill of reading comprehension requires, in particular, not just that we fill them up with information, but that we invite them to take a critical stance, to do what Hilary Jenks talks about when she says that first you've got to read with the text in order to be able to understand it. And then you need to read against the text to be able to question, to be able to wonder, to be able to investigate what's going on. Peter Freebody and Alan Luke are two other folks from Australia that we have so much to thank for about helping all of us as a field to be able to understand the importance of a critical stance and the importance of not just being a consumer, a passive consumer, but to actually being an active producer. And again, in looking at so many of your documents, it's clear that this message is embedded and infused within all of that, fostering the critical and metacognitive awareness that's necessary for students, certainly outlined in the literacy and numeracy guidebooks as well. Those VET pathways that help us to be able to articulate for students what their aspirations are, and then to be able to show that path for how it is that you can achieve those particular aspirations. When I talk about thrill, I sometimes get asked a question that perhaps somebody has asked you, I don't know, once or twice in your career, and that is, how do you make kids love reading? How do you make that happen? So I'll turn that question around in a different way. Remember 20 years ago when an element of what it was that we were thinking about as a field was, how do you get teachers to use technology in their classroom? Do you remember 20 years ago when that was like a big burning question? Like now, 2020, you look at it and go, I don't know how I would teach without technology. But 20 years ago, it was a big deal, right? And I can't imagine that the methods that you used here in South Australia or that we used in the States included things like requiring that teachers log on for 20 minutes a day. Just, 20 arbitrary minutes a day, you need to log on to your technology. I can't imagine that we just flooded their classrooms with technologies that they didn't know how to use, and then hope by osmosis somehow that technology would end up being something that would be living and present within the classrooms. And I can't imagine that any of us as school leaders said, well, we'll just give them free technology time, and they'll pick whatever technologies that they want to use. None of those approaches would have worked at all. What happened was that teachers infused technology in meaningful ways into their classroom as they saw its purpose. Purpose is what fuels any kind of complex behavior. When you know what the purpose is, you're much more likely to be able to engage in that. So how do you make kids love reading? You make sure that the readings that they're doing are linked to their purpose, that they are not low-level, compliance-level kinds of experiences, but that in particular, that we make sure that we position text, whether it is multimedia text, whether it is text that is in print form or in digital form, that we use purpose through inquiry to make sure that students understand why it is that we're reading the things that we're doing. So I'll share a practice that we use at the school where Doug Fisher and I work. Every spring, because for us the spring of the school year is approaching the end of the school year. So every spring, late in the spring, we invite all of the students in the school to be able to submit possible questions that are used as school-wide essential questions. And we compile those questions into a ballot form because, as you can imagine, when you've got 700 kids that are submitting questions, there are some repeats that are along the way. So we do a bit of compilation of all of those. And then we turn the voting over to students only. No adult gets to be able to choose what the 4 school-wide essential questions for the following year are going to be. The top 4 vote getters become next year's school-wide essential questions. They come directly from the student body in making sure that student voice is there. Now, some of the questions, I got to be honest with you, I kind of roll my eyes because there's always one that's in there about love. I work with teenagers. That's what it is that keeps them awake at night, are questions around love. So that usually ends up being some form of question that happens. But they also ask profound questions. And here are just a couple of them. What is race, and does it matter? You can only imagine the deep conversations that having that question school-wide prompted for all of us. It gives teachers permission to be able to have those complex questions and to do that kind of reading that they need. Here was another one. Does age matter? You exist, but do you live? Can you imagine all of the texts that you can bring in, whether you are a science teacher, whether you are a history teacher, whether you are an English teacher, whether you are a maths teacher, to be able to bring those in as well. Here's another one of those. What's the difference between surviving and living? Our maths teachers in particular, do you like how I use the word maths? I'm super proud of myself. Super proud. I've got the spelling all figured out. I know about reception teachers. Maths, yeah. I also know about brekkies and sunnies too, by the way. Just I want to share those. I'm getting down with the whole vocabulary here. What our maths teachers will often do is their connections that they have to these school-wide essential questions include things like making sure that students have access to statistical information that's provided by, for example, ourworldindata.org is a wonderful site to be able to find that, so that they learn about how it is that quantitative data are represented in visual formats in particular. And where it is that we always want to be able to move our students to when they're reading those more complex texts is asking them, what does this text inspire you to do? Because it's always about action, about how it is not only that you consume information, but how it is that you figure out what your actions are going to be. And this is just a short list of actions that can take place. But here's where the thrill comes into play. Getting to be able to work toward your private world and your public world along the way. The day the crayons quit, for the folks that work in primary, has been a hit for a lot of years. For those of you that don't hang out with this book, the crayons go on strike because they are having a conflict with one another, and Duncan, who is the little boy who owns the crayons, has to try and make some sense and come to consensus and compromise with all of these different crayons. And I was in a kindergarten or reception classroom when students had been working toward this particular book. What does this text inspire you to do? There were kids that went off in different directions about this. There were some kids who wanted to find out about how often the sun was being portrayed as being yellow versus how often the sun was being portrayed as orange, because yellow and orange get into a big fight about all of this. And so they were on the internet using those Google images to be able to look at how it was that the sun was represented. There was a child who was writing her own version of the story about her shoes and about the conflict that the shoes in her closet might be having. And I took a photo of one of the kids who said she wanted to write a letter to all of them, and her letter was, how about you and orange both be the color of the sun? And she wrote as well, dear green, I made the yellow and orange's problem go away because I am a good problem solver. Isn't that powerful to be able to know when you're 5 years old, you know how to solve problems along the way? When we think about taking action on the world, it should never be lost that this is central to what it is that we try to accomplish every day in terms of equity and in terms of inclusivity. That they are not, those efforts are not separate from what happens in our classrooms as we teach and deepen students' reading comprehension. One of my colleagues at the University of Georgia talks about how important it is that we have, for reading teachers, reflective questions that we're always thinking about as we move students to action, as we move students in being able to work upon their private and their public worlds. And in particular, she talks about these 4 questions, that in terms of skill, always asking as a teacher, how will my instruction and my text selection build students' literacy skills and standards? That is absolutely essential to be able to do. But going beyond that, building intellect. As reading teachers asking, how will my instruction and text selection build students' knowledge and mental powers? In terms of identity, how will my instruction and text selection help students learn something about themselves and something about others? And most importantly of all, that lens around criticality. How will my instruction and text selection engage students in thinking about power, equity, and the disruption of oppression? Every time that we make decisions in classrooms about the text that we choose or not, the instruction that we use or not, is a political act. And it's essential that we understand what those political acts are. I'm going to close out with 2 ideas that came from 2 giants in the field of reading. About a year and a half ago, I was at a Feststreit, and if you haven't been to one of those, it's essentially this. It's a retirement party for a scholar and researcher, where people come together and they talk about the contributions that that person has made to their field. And so I was in attendance at David Pearson's Feststreit last year, and Dick Anderson was one of the people who was at that Feststreit. And he said in his remarks that we must, as a field, move past the idea that reading comprehension is about the passive reception and understanding of information, that we have to always be thinking about how it is that we create active producers. And he said in particular that we need students to be explainers, whether they're using verbal language or whether they're using written language, to explain the physical, the biological, and the social world. That we need students to be storytellers, that they carry with them and they're able to transmit the real and imagined lives of others and of themselves. And that we need students to be arguers, that we need them to be able to use reasoning and factual information in order to be able to articulate ways in which we can go forward and we can improve the world. So what's the point of all of this? As I said, the party that I was at was for David Pearson. And in his closing remarks, after everybody else had talked about the work that he had done and where it is that our field needs to go forward, he said this. He talked about reading comprehension as being on a path, and that path needs to go somewhere. And he said, in terms of reading comprehension, phonemic awareness, which might be important if it's on the path to phonics, which might be important if it's on the path to fluency, which might be important if it's on the path to vocabulary, which might be important if it's on the path to comprehension, which might be important if it's on the path to critical reasoning and problem solving, which may be important if it's all about action in the world, about changing something that matters. That's why it is that we do what we do. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today, and thank you.